Reggie here, your fellow neighborhood bodybuilder and comic book collector, and I want to welcome you to another one of my videos. Honestly, this is like take 1000. I normally don't struggle when it comes time to shoot a video, but with this particular topic, the struggle is real. And it's honestly a topic that I wasn't the most excited to talk about, and maybe that's why I am struggling with it. But I am going to persevere. We are going to talk about Newsstand versus Direct. And at the bequest of several different subscribers, I am finally going to dig into this topic and try to do it in a way where people walk away with a better understanding of the differences between Newsstand and Direct without getting mired in a lot of the intricate details that go along with this subject. And my thought here is to essentially provide you with a primer, if you will, for Newsstand versus Direct. And if you have a desire to go deeper, you can absolutely do that. As you know, with our hobby, minute differences matter a lot. There is a big difference between a 9.8 and a 9.6, sometimes in terms of value, not necessarily in terms of actual defects to that particular comic. But there are big differences when it comes to the value of a 9.8 versus a 9.6 in many cases. Minor differences are and can be very important in this hobby. And when it comes to Newsstand and Direct, this is another nuance. It is another way to identify what is potentially special about one book versus another. And so that's why it's really important to kind of understand the differences between Newsstand and Direct. So first, let me say that what basically has happened over time is that the comic book industry has moved away from Newsstand as the means to distribute comics to primarily doing direct. And I think the evolution continues because now there are some publishers out there that are actually doing digital distribution directly to the consumer, but we'll save that topic for another day. But publishers originally had one means to distribute their comics, their products, and that was basically to newsstands. So bookstores, physical newsstands with periodicals, convenience stores like 7-Eleven, et cetera, et cetera. That was the primary means. And so basically, publishers printed up comics, they sent them to these retail outlets for sale to the public. In the event that something was not sold at one of these retailers, they had the ability to send those comics back to the publisher and actually get a refund or a credit for the unsold items. Now, this doesn't necessarily work for publishers because they don't know how many books to print. They also don't know how many will be sold. They also don't know how many are going to come back unsold at the end of the day. So it's not really a good way to run a business because you technically can't recognize revenue until after all of the refunds have been sent back. All of the books that have been returned have been received, and then the credits and the refunds are issued. It's not a great way to run a business. And as on the retail side, you technically had to bundle up all these unsold comics and send them back to the publisher. Not the most efficient thing. And over time, they moved towards just allowing retailers to rip part of the cover off and send it back to get the credit, but still not an ideal system. Over time, what happened is that publishers moved towards the direct model, right? Comic shops were starting to take off. Comic shops were responsible for placing accurate orders to maintain their profitability with publishers or with the distributor, however you choose to look at it, for the number of books that they wanted to receive. The publisher, for their point, knew how many books to actually print off. And they didn't have to worry about anything being returned to them because anything going the direct route to a local comic shop could not be returned. And so the evolution of the model made a lot more sense for the players versus the newsstand. Now, what does any of this matter? It matters because at various points over time, the market shifted from primarily being newsstand to primarily being direct. Now, where that really matters is in the late 80s. And that is important because when the shift started to happen in 1979, basically 94% of comics were still distributed via the newsstand route, that distribution model. But as the distribution became bifurcated, there was a little bit of shift towards direct. So in 1979, 94% were newsstand, 6% of comics were actually direct. In 1982, the shift happened even more. 80% were newsstand, 20% direct. Fast forward to 1985, it was actually a 50-50 split at that point. When you look at 1987, the direct was 70% by this time, which left only 30% via newsstand. In 1990, the shift continued. 15% of comics that were sold were actually newsstand. 85% were direct. In 1995, 10% were newsstand, with 90% actually being direct. And by the time we reached 2013, only 1% of comics were actually distributed via newsstand versus 99% being direct. So that shift from newsstand to direct was pretty rapid. Now, again, what does any of this matter? If you have two comics that are in front of you, and one is a newsstand and one is a direct, a lot of people like to say that the newsstand is always the better option, but that isn't necessarily the case. You have to look at the year in which that newsstand comic was actually presented or printed. And so if you look at 1985, for example, it was a 50-50 split. So a newsstand comic was no more rare than a direct comic in 1985. Now, if you were to fast forward to 2013, only 1% of comics were actually newsstand versus 99% that were actually direct. So in that case, a newsstand comic in 2013 was much more rare than a direct comic. And so some would make the argument that in that particular year, for example, it would be better for you to go with the newsstand comic versus that same grade of comic in a direct. And again, that's because minor differences actually matter. Again, let's talk about this. Let's dig a little bit deeper. Why does this matter? So if you had two comics side by side in 2013, one is a newsstand and one is a direct comic, which one would you select? A lot of people would say you should pick the newsstand version. And the reason for that is, again, only 1% of comics that were printed in 2013 were actually distributed via that method. And so that comic is much more rare than one that was actually distributed via the direct model. And if you think about it, that comic in the newsstand had to survive an employee who handles newspapers and magazines that doesn't necessarily see the value in a comic. It was put on a shelf with the general public who, again, does not appreciate what a comic actually is, right? Versus one that is actually distributed via the direct model, where it goes to a local comic shop, where you have a local comic shop employees and owners who respect comics, and you also have collectors who also respect comics. And so not only is that newsstand comic much more rare, but it also had to survive a lot more than the direct comic. So those are just some of the differences that exist between newsstand and also direct. One of the next questions people oftentimes ask is, which one should I buy if I have a choice? Well, you have to remember that not all newsstand comics are actually created equally. And what I mean by that is that if you look at 1985, for example, the distribution model was bifurcated, yes, but it was also still a 50-50 split. So 50% of comics were newsstand, 50% were direct. And so it's important to not just make blanket statements and say that newsstands are always better than direct comics, because that's not the case. You have to look at the book and you have to look at the year in which that comic were produced or printed. For me, I don't necessarily put more value on a newsstand comic than a direct comic. And I know in my videos, I oftentimes point out that one is newsstand and one might not be newsstand, but I personally don't place any extra value on that newsstand comic. A lot of people do. A lot of people really appreciate newsstand comics much more than direct comics. But if I had two equally graded comics that were sitting in front of me, I would, yes, opt for the newsstand version because they're the exact same grade. But if I had two comics in front of me and the direct was actually let's say a 9.6 and the newsstand was actually a 9.2 or even a 9.4, I'm going to pick the higher grade comic. I would not, again, prioritize the newsstand over the overall better grade of the comic. And again, this is my personal opinion. I think everyone has to decide what's important for them when it comes down to collecting. But my hope is that this primer, this video provides you just a little bit of insight into the differences between newsstand comics and also those that are distributed via the direct model. Certainly, if you have questions, issues, comments, or thoughts, don't hesitate to put them in the comment section because I will be reading and responding to those. But you can also reach out to me at Regie Collects on Instagram and regiecollects@gmail.com. Take care.